The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve, Chapter 3, Central Banking by Committee. The authority of the Fed's Board of Governors. At present, the Board of Directors are a sort of semi-trustees for the nation. I would have them real trustees and with a good trust deed. Walter Begot, 1873. In the mid-1990s, just before the true height of Greenspan mania, a tremor shook the Federal Reserve Board's headquarters, as 4 of the 7 members of the board, including the Governor Janet L. Yellen, met with Chair Greenspan to demand better treatment. As reported in the Washington Post, the 4 board members were not complaining about policy. Rather, they were frustrated that no one was keeping them adequately informed of the staff's activities, including discussions with the Treasury Department and research on international financial issues. They felt the figureheads as though Chair Greenspan had used the staff to sideline them despite their legal role in setting Fed policy during the same time. A departing senior staff member at the Fed said he never had an interest in becoming a board member. It would have to be reduced his influence over the Fed's policies if he did. The complaining governors knew they were lower on Greenspan's totem pole than the senior staff. They wanted better. In congressional testimony following the Post reporting, members of Congress challenged Greenspan on his dominance of the Fed. He countered the charge by modestly invoking the Federal Reserve Act. All of the authority of the Federal Reserve Board is within the board members themselves. I, as chief executive, have one statutory authority. I run the meetings. Legally, Greenspan was mostly right. The legal authority of the Federal Reserve is not deposited in individuals, but 2 overlapping committees, the Board of Governors for all regulatory authority and the Federal Open Market Committee for monetary authority and practice. However, the authority of the Fed is quite different. As Greenspan well knew, he had in fact concentrated the authority of the central bank in the hands of a single individual, arguably more than any of his predecessors. This extraordinary mismatch between the legal concentration authority of the Board of Governors on the one hand and the practical authority in person of a single individual is one of the most fascinating elements of the Fed's governance. As a result, the governors are like Begot's Bank of England directors, almost semi-trustees. In this chapter, we will understand better how law and practice relate to each in creating this unusual trusteeship, and how the governors participate or not in influencing the space within which the Fed makes policy. It is a more interesting and more complete story than one that starts and ends with the Fed chair, the legal authority of the chair and the board. As noted in Chapter 1, the exact character, even the very existence of the original Federal Reserve Board was a source of controversy. The most controversial feature of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, but the Banking Act of 1935 replaced the Federal Reserve Board with more robust, if clumsily named, Board of the Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The change to governors from members was especially noteworthy. The 1935 Act literally took away the prestige of the title from the heads of the reserve banks, called after 1935 presidents, and deposited that prestige in the public appointees who would now govern the entire system. The idea in 1935 was to deposit in the 7-person committee, one of whom to be designated as chair of the authority of the Federal Reserve System. There remains statutory and practical tension between the reserve banks and the Board of Governors, as we have already discussed and will discuss again. But there is another statutory tension between the governors and the Fed chair. The Federal Reserve Act is a much amended and in some places quite technical statute, but the powers of the chair, or in the statutory parlance, the chairman, are very easy to summarize, if slightly more expansive than Greenspan's congressional testimony quoted above. The total of the chair's legal authorities and requirements consist of appearing before Congress twice a year, serving a term of 4 years, being the active executive officer of the Board of Governors, presiding over the board's meetings, certifying in writing the Federal Reserve Bank that a depository institution is viable for supervisory purposes, delegating nearly any board function to Fed employees, and authorizing the publication of certain kinds of sensitive information. There is also an old provision that governs how the Fed can redeem old notes under the gold standard. In other words, just 8 duties. By contrast, the Board of Governors as a governing body is cited in the Federal Reserve Act over 400 times. Even in these 8 circumstances, the chair's authority isn't absolute. The vice chair or even a chair pro tempore can preside over board meetings in the chair's absence. More importantly, any single member of the board can effectively override the provision that allows the chair to delegate nearly any of the board's functions to nearly any employee within the system. The board shall, upon vote of one member, review action taken at a delegated level within such time, and in such manner the board shall by rule prescribe. One might argue that the key authority granted in the act to the chair is the whole ball game. The chair is the chair. After all, so surely that position means leadership, if not complete control. But even this authority is quite limited. The act suggests that if anything the chair reports to the board, the chairman of the board, subject to its supervision, shall be its active executive officer. That is, the governors are to supervise the chair, not the other way around. Of course, the chair is a member of the board, but that is the point. If the chair wants to promote a certain policy, he must convince a majority of colleagues first. 3. For board matters, or 6. For FOMC matters. To get better sense of the legal story of the chair's primacy or lack thereof, it's useful to compare it to another prominent committee of experts that presides over a significant portion of the American democracy, the U.S. Supreme Court. Like the Board of the Governors, the Supreme Court is a committee that consists of one chief and several associates. In the court's case, 8 associates, for 9 justices total. All 9 justices vote to choose the cases. The court will decide. They all hear oral arguments and question the litigants, lawyers. They all vote on those cases, dispositions, and then they all write and sign majority concurring and dissenting opinions. Structurally, there's not much of a difference between the court and the board and FOMC. The justices have one vote, just as the governors or members of the FOMC do. Of course, the Chief of Justice is not the same as the Associate Justices. He has specific duties not granted to other justices. The Chief Justice appoints judges to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, oversees the Federal Judicial Conference effectively. The Chief Justice is the chief executive of the judicial branch and is on the governing board of the Smithsonian Institution. By practice, the Chief Justice is also the most senior justice, regardless of the timing of the appointment. This means that he chooses who will write the opinion of any majority or dissent that will be joined by the Chief Justice, but that's about it. If the Chief Justice wants his view of the case to prevail, the votes of 4 colleagues must be gained through reason, not will. The same is true for any other justice. The votes of the Chief and Associate Justices count the same. As a result, for this formal and practical equality, Associate Justices are rightly viewed as important figures in our democracy with significant power over the lives of people in it. A rigorous and highly public vetting process surrounds the presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. They appear on Sesame Street and 60 Minutes. Their views are heavily scrutinized in the media. The additional statutory responsibilities of the Chief Justice fall away as mostly immaterial. There is simply no denying the essential and distinct role that each Associate Justice plays. The Board of Governors is somehow different. Only the most avid of Fed watchers know the names of the other members of the board, and rarely does the public become excited about the appointment process that places its members there. In practice, there is also a tradition empathetically unlike that of the Supreme Court of near unanimity on board of in FOMC decisions. I want to say unanimously or anonymity, but I said unanimity. Fuck, like I got fucking speech impediments. Unanimity. Anonymity. You fucking namity. Unanimity. on board in FOMC decisions. Even with the most controversial of decisions, the board in FOMC usually speaks through the voice of the chair. While some members of the latter committee have issued dissenting statements from the FOMC policy decisions, there are very few instances where the chair is in dissent. According to one former governor, the chairman is expected to resign if the FOMC rejects his policy recommendation. Exactly how the unanimity or near unanimity arose in practice is unclear. That exists, however, is beyond dispute. The legal architecture exists for governors to influence Fed policy, but does it exist in practice? Historically, the answer is sometimes, as the Kennedy and Johnson appointees began to reflect a very different economic orientation from William McChesney Martin. For example, the chair started adapting his views and even offered LBJ his resignation in desperation. It was rejected. And before there was a palace intrigue about governor discontent at the Greenspan Fed, newspapers covered the same kind of intrigue at the Volcker Fed. Though the steady drip of appointments during the Reagan administration, Volcker started to lose control of his board and eventually lost a couple of close votes on the board when the Reagan appointees sought to support the administration in the way that Volcker found inappropriate. Although Volcker prevailed at reversing the first of these votes, largely through slamming doors and angrily threatening to resign, it was clear that the governors were more influential than the chair on determining the board's policy outcomes. The president's strategic use of the appointment power to stack the board with his appointees then can allow a group of governors to act together as a counterweight to the Fed chair. Individual governor influence. The case of Dan Trujillo Tarullo. Waiting for a like-minded majority is not the only way that an individual governor can shape the Fed's policy-making space. The best illustration of individual influence is the person of a current as of this writing. Fed Governor Daniel K. Tarullo is arguably the most important non-chair governor in history of the modern Federal Reserve System. His experience is worth considering in full. Tarullo was not early in his career and obviously candidate for the title of most influential non-chair governor in Fed history. Raised in his working-class suburbs of Boston, Tarullo excelled academically and eventually landed as assistant professor at Harvard Law School. During a time of bitter ideological clashes among the faculty and students, Tarullo came to identify with the minority faction of legal theorists on the radical left, and a consequence was denied tenure of revenge by the right for the school's move in a liberal direction in recent years. Tarullo himself expressed the hope that he would turn out to be sacrificial victim rather than the first of purge victims. After leaving the academy to work on Senator Kennedy's staff and in the Clinton administration, Tarullo became a law professor at Georgetown. There, he wrote a significant book on the proposed framework for international banking regulation negotiated between 1999 and 2004, and colloquially known as Basel II. Basel, after the city in Switzerland, hosts the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, where the framework is negotiated and published, and second, because it was the second such negotiated framework. In it, he strongly criticized two of the essential components of the framework: the use of the internal ratings-based models of risk management, or allowing banks rather than regulators to evaluate their own risk, and the definition of capital, quotations, the Basel and the large financial institutions used in calculating and regulating that risk. Bank capital regulation is notoriously technical. Even so, Tarullo's criticisms are not difficult to grasp. The Basel Accords focus on two aspects of banking: capital quotations and liquidity quotations. Capital quotations, again, here is a tricky and misleading bit of banking jargon. It doesn't have anything to do with the bank's cash on hand, but with the way that it raises money from another people and institutions. Capital quotations is the bank's equity quotations. That is, funding that comes through shareholders as opposed to creditors or creditors. The focus on capital is important because banks that carry too much debt become the centers of financial crises. In a crisis, debt is the mechanism that transfers risk. If investors lose their shirts in equity markets, they lose their own money. There can, of course, be significant and negative economic implications for equity crises, but we see financial crises only when people, and especially banks, are borrowing money throughout the economy. When questions arise about banks and individuals' ability to repay that money, especially if those questions weren't widely foreseen, a panic can ensue. From a banking regulatory perspective, virtually everyone agrees that banks that borrow too much create enormous instability for the rest of us. The Basel framework is designed to address the questions that arise after his relatively facile agreement on principle is reached, such as how much debt is too much, how do you define capital, quotations, question mark, and whom do you trust to measure these things in first place, question mark. Tarullo's book criticized Basel II's answers to the last two questions among the criticisms of the process. At the same time, he engaged this rather technical debate of interest to few beyond the banking regulatory community. He had made friends with the junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. The two had almost overlapped at Harvard, Tarullo as a left-leaning junior law professor, Obama as a left-leaning law student. As leader among the students on the left closely following the faculty's tenure battles, Obama had almost certainly heard about Tarullo's lost tenure battle. By 2005, the two were once again in contact rather than join the presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton, as many of his associates from the Clinton years had done. Tarullo signed on with the Obama campaign in 2007 and began advising the senator on economic and financial policy. After the election, Tarullo was among the first announced appointments of the new administration. Tarullo would become a new governor at the Federal Reserve. This was an old appointment. Fed governors are not typically the post associated with presidential confidence. The leading economic advisors for someone of Tarullo's proximity to Obama, previous experience in a Democratic administration, and broad base of expertise. A more appropriate appointment might have been the Deputy Secretary of Treasury, Director of the National Economic Council, or some other position of prominence. But Tarullo was not chosen for the post and appears almost nowhere as a figure on the Obama administration's sometimes multi-headed economic policy team. That included Director of the National Economic Council Lawrence Summers, Secretary of the Treasury Timothy Geithner, Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors Christina Rommers, and Director of the Office of Management and Budget Peter Orszag. Where Tarullo stood on the pecking order of Obama's economic team is clear. Even in the president-elect's own press announcement, Tarullo is an afterthought. After setting up an announcement as the president-elect's call for a 21st century regulatory framework to ensure that a crisis like this can never happen again, his press announced the nominations of two top regulatory officials, Mary Shapiro as chairwoman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and Gary Gensler as the chair of the Committee Futures Trading Commission. Only at the end of the press release did the public learn that President-elect Obama also announced the appointment of Dan Tarullo to the Federal Reserve Board. No matter Tarullo was part of Obama's intentional effort to change the way that banking regulation and supervision occurred at the Federal Reserve. In Obama's own words during the speech that accompanied the trio's appointment, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy function will continue to be critical in navigating us through these trying times. But as many of you know, the Federal Reserve also serves as a vital regulatory function. In reference to Tarullo's Basel book, Obama noted his academic and policy work on financial regulation has anticipated some of the problems we have observed and he has generated important ideas for how we should move forward. Tarullo wasted no time in acting on his mandate. Even in his confirmation hearing, he assured Senate Republicans that blame for the crisis lay not with the financial industry but with the regulators, including his new employees at the Fed in Washington. His effort in increasing accountability for successful had failed. His bank supervision spread throughout the system. According to press reports, Tarullo wrote a stinging internal review for the bank supervision at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta when the incumbent I've pronounced that word before, I don't know why the fuck, head of bank supervision at the Atlanta Fed retired shortly after Tarullo arrived. The Board of Governors appointed 3 people from outside the area to temporarily run the bank supervision. In Atlanta, a move that several inside the central bank read as Washington tightening its scrutiny of regional offices. This wasn't just a problem with the reserve banks. Tarullo is reported to have an overbearing skepticism of banks and supervisors, generally a skepticism so pronounced that some Fed supervisors are so wary of being second-guessed that they ask him to approve even mundane bank applications, not necessarily known for a gentle demeanor. Fuck that. Some Fed staffers who work under him trade tales about which Tarullo blow-up was the most legendary. Tarullo made clear at the very beginning that he thought the Fed supervisors had made mistakes in supervision and that he wouldn't justify their past actions. Tarullo has done more than reinvigorate banking supervision at the Fed, a process he called trying to get supervisory stars, quotations, on the ground, working with the banks. He also pursued the mandate Obama gave him at the start of his appointment. He has led the charge in banking regulation, giving major speeches, sometimes quite controversial speeches, on nearly every aspect of financial regulation. These efforts have included threats to break up the largest banks and otherwise make the cost of business for systematically important financial institutions greater to reflect the risks that such institutions bring to the system. It has included sometimes novel proposals such as making banks' boards of directors more responsible for risk management through their fiduciary duties, a proposal that prompted swift and negative reaction from banking insiders. All told, Tarullo's efforts have appeared to some within industry as, to quote H. Rodgan Cohen, the dean of the banking law bar in New York City, a true revolution in regulation. Revolution might be an overstatement, but there is no doubting that his influence has been felt on nearly every aspect of the way banking supervision occurs in the system, including through the emphasis of the Federal Reserve banks in the process. These efforts have come back to his old critiques of the international banking regulatory framework. He has shepherded the implementation of Basel III's reforms, including increased capital requirements and the regulation of foreign banks operating in the United States, grounding in the critiques he made as an academic. He has even more recently signaled his continuing skepticism of the internal ratings-based approaches to calculating capital. These reforms are part of the most important financial regulatory overhaul in 3 generations. In each of these instances, they have been crafted and delivered not by the Congress or the President, and not by the Fed chair or even a vice chairman. A Fed governor was the architect and spokesman for them all. In this sense, he was unprecedented. The conclusion of one profile sums it up nicely. Unlike previous banks, regulators, and supervisors, he went further, pushed harder, and accumulated massive power, all while alienating some inside the cloistered, genteel Federal Reserve, and those outside in the banking industry as well with this combustible style. It is too early to assess Tarullo's legacy as a regulator, but it is not too early to conclude that he has been arguably the most influential governor in the history of the modern Federal Reserve System. Aside from the Fed chairs, no other governor has left such an imprint on the space within the Fed makes policies. It is possible, even likely, that there won't be another like him. With all respect for the work that Trujillo has done as governor, I don't know about respect, y'all shouldn't have used that word. I don't give a fuck. This conclusion is not meant to be a compliment of his singular talents. In fact, there are 4 reasons for Trujillo's successes, 3 of which are essentially out of his control. First, Trujillo had the support of the president, and in fact, he was nominated as part of the team of regulators meant to change the way we think of financial regulation. Second, and perhaps more important, he had the full support of the Fed chair, unlike other shifts in power within the Federal Reserve System. Over its history, Trujillo's influence was not wrested from an unwilling Fed chair, but reflected his willing concision from the very beginning of Trujillo's tenure. Ben Bernanke deferred to him on banking regulatory matters, despite Bernanke's total of 6 years' experience as a banking regulator by the time Trujillo came aboard in January 2009. Third, at the time of his appointments, the external political climate was highly favorable to Trujillo's reform orientation. Fourth, and finally, Trujillo's own expertise on the subject made him well suited for executing his agenda of propaganda. I added that word, but that's probably what it is. Only the fourth factor was within Trujillo's control. The counterexample, the case of Alan Blinder. To make sense of how important these other factors have been, it's worth comparing Trujillo's tenure to that of another distinguished but far less influential predecessor, Alan S. Blinder, the Fed's vice chair for 18 months in the mid-1990s. Blinder was a star economist at Princeton, a well-regarded and influential macroeconomist. He came to Washington after Bill Clinton was elected and joined the administration as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors. When the vice chairman of the Board of Governors came open, Blender was the Clintons' pick. We're going to go with Blinder from now on. First nomination to the Fed's board. In fact, given the previous 3 presidential terms had been Republican, 2 for Reagan, 1 for George H.W. Bush, Blinder was the first Democratic appointee in 14 years. Despite his stature, Blinder was certainly a more experienced economist than Greenspan, for example. He lacked the strong support of Greenspan. In fact, Greenspan may have viewed Blinder as a competitor at the time of his appointment to the Fed. It was rumored that he was the logical choice as Greenspan's successor when the latter's team as chairman ended in 1996. Perhaps as a result, Blinder's brief tenure was marked by a discord between Blinder and the Fed staff, and Blinder and Greenspan nearly from the beginning. Although this story may be apocryphal, it is said that the Fed insiders learned of Clinton's intention to nominate Blinder. One governor reviewed Blinder's record and reported that while probably softer on inflation, the Republican central bankers he'd be joining, it's not like he's a communist. Greenspan allegedly replied, "I would have preferred if he were a communist." The clash between Greenspan and Blinder didn't come through formal channels and differing votes on inflation. Blinder didn't dissent once during his time on the FOMC. They clashed instead of the internal politics of the Federal Reserve. By then completely in the thrall of oracular Greenspan, one senior staffer's philosophical take on the dispute summarizes perfectly the tension between the legal form of the Fed's governing committees and the power of personality in abridging those forms. You have an institution here where the Board of Governors is supposed to, by design of legislation, to run the place, he said. Instead, it is really run by the chairman of the senior staff. While the board having a certain rubber stamp authority, Blinder didn't come to the Fed to be a rubber stamp. He was looking for changes. Changes, however, weren't looking for Blinder. He clashed with the senior staff economists who expected he would be accepted the economic models they presented without challenge. as his colleagues of the FOMC had long done since those models and conclusions almost invariably supported the policy recommendations that Greenspan supported. Blender sought more options from the staff, more interaction with junior staffers, and more opportunities for the other governors to participate in the hard work of making the nation's economic policy. Ultimately, it just didn't work. Blender left the board after 18 months and returned to the academia. Greenspan was confirmed to this third term as a chair a month later. Why would Blender fail when Tarullo had succeeded? It is obliviously not in the difference in their credentials, expertise, or respect they commanded in their fields. Although law professors and economists don't compare perfectly, it is hard to imagine a better credentialed or regardless academic than Blender. The difference was in the other three factors. Even though Blender had been on Clinton's economic policy staff before his appointments to the Fed, he was not installed with a mandate to change the place. As we will see in Chapter 8 on presidential interactions with the Fed chairs, Clinton made wooing Greenspan a central part of his political strategy. In the announcement accompanying his appointment, Clinton did not identify the problem of the chair centrism at the Fed, nor the need to internal institutional reform. The economic climate of the time also did not suggest a public appetite for reform along the lines that Blender proposed. Perhaps most important of all, Greenspan did not support Blender's efforts at reform. While Blender denied any personal feud between the two, the changes Blender sought were changes in the way that the other governors participated in the Fed's policy-making process. In this way, whether Blender was a competitor for the chair or not, he was certainly a threat to Greenspan's leadership. Any enhancement of the governors that Blender had in mind came at the expense of the chair and his close, dominating relationship with the senior staff. The Fed is an institution of institutions. The chair has come to dominate it in the political attention, but such dominance is required neither by law nor by practice. As another former governor put in his memoir, success of the Board of Governors is not a question of credentials or brilliance. The fact is that it's also relationships with the staffs, your peers, and the chairman that influence your effectiveness as a governor. The individuals and their relationships with the Fed shape its institutional policy making space in profound ways. Conclusion: central banking by committee, ? Headliner for the end of this chapter 3. This chapter has argued that the law of the Fed governance and its practice are often at cross purposes. The result is a curious dynamic of Ulysses Punch Bowl theory. The Fed independence emphasizes law, but also emphasizes that the idea that the central bank is a conception is that the central bank is a single monolithic unit in the case of the Federal Reserve. This conception is inconsistent with the Federal Reserve Act. Any influence individual Fed chairs have on the system comes from the exercise of leadership, not the enforcement of statutory authority.